The flight of entitlement. I don't know what it is about air travel that seems to bring out the absolute worst in some people. Maybe it's the stress, the lack of control, the close quarters. Whatever it is, something about sitting in a flying metal tube at 35,000 feet unlocks a special kind of entitlement in certain individuals. I thought I'd seen it all before, but this flight, a cross-country trip from Seattle to Miami, taught me that there's always someone ready to set a new gold standard for audacity. It all started the moment I stepped into the cabin. I'm the kind of traveler who prepares. I'm not talking about overpacking or bringing a neck pillow the size of a German shepherd. I mean, I do my research. I know which seats have the best legroom, which rows are furthest from the bathrooms, and which window seats are misaligned with the windows themselves. I treat selecting a plane seat like I'm picking stock options, and I always make sure I pay the little extra fee for the window. It's not even luxury for me. It's necessity. The window seat gives me control, a small, rare slice of personal space in a world where space is constantly shrinking. I can lean against the fuselage, close my eyes, and drift off without worrying about anyone clambering over me to go to the bathroom every 10 minutes. I can also stare out at the endless sky, reminding myself that flying is still something between magic and miracle. This time, I had locked down seat 12A right over the wing, with a perfect view. I had even checked the seat map 3 days in a row to make sure the layout was accurate. I thought I was prepared for anything. I wasn't prepared for her. The first time I saw her, I assumed, naively, that she was just a harried mom doing her best. She had a boy with her, maybe 8 years old, with that jittery pre-flight excitement kids get. He was bouncing on his toes, talking nonstop, a wellspring of curiosity and uncontainable energy. She was juggling a backpack, a purse, and one of those beat-up stuffed animals that looked like it had been dragged through every puddle and playground from here to eternity. She glanced at her boarding pass, then at the seat numbers, then at me. Her expression shifted the second she registered I was in that seat. Her seat, or at least the one she had apparently assigned herself in her mind. There was a flicker of calculation in her eyes, the kind that people get right before they decide rules don't apply to them. "Excuse me," she said, plastering on a strained smile. "My son's been so excited to see the clouds from the window. Would you mind switching seats with us?" Her son, bless him, was busy spinning his stuffed elephant by the trunk like a tiny lasso. He couldn't have cared less about the window, at least not in that moment. I would have happily given up my seat if I sensed it was a real need, if there was a scared child or a person with a real condition. But this was a power play dressed up in the language of kindness. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice polite but firm. "I specifically booked this seat." Her smile vanished so quickly it was like a mask had been yanked off. "Oh," she said, as if the concept of personal reservations was brand new to her. "Well, it's just, he's never flown before. It would mean so much to him." Her son was now upside down in his seat, feet where his head should be, completely uninterested in the window, me, or the conversation. "I understand," I said, "but I paid extra for this seat. I'd prefer to keep it." That should have been the end of it, but as anyone who's ever dealt with a professional entitled parentum knows, no is not a word they process like the rest of us do. To her, no wasn't a polite refusal, it was a personal affront, an attack on her parental rights and her child's destiny to sit wherever he wanted just because. Her lips tightened. She huffed loudly, one of those exaggerated sighs that's meant for public consumption. "I just thought," she muttered, loud enough for everyone around us to hear, "that people would have a little more kindness for a single mom traveling alone." And there it was, the sympathy card, played within minutes. I didn't engage. The fastest way to lose your sanity in these situations is to open the door to debate. People like her aren't looking for solutions. They're looking for confrontation they can win. I pulled out my headphones and made a show of putting them in. Classic nonverbal signal. Conversation over. She wasn't having it. She switched strategies, leaning across her son to make sure her muttering was audible over my imaginary music. "Some people," she said, "just don't know how to show compassion anymore." There was no mistaking the target of that comment. I ignored her. She wasn't going to guilt me into giving up the seat I planned and paid for. Not today. The plane filled up. People filed past, dragging overstuffed carry-ons and looking for overhead space like it was buried treasure. Every now and then, someone glanced our way, sensing the tension but wisely choosing not to get involved. I thought maybe, just maybe, she would let it go once we took off. Then she played her next card. Public spectacle. As the plane taxied, she started narrating her tragic plight to no one in particular. "It's just so hard," she said to the air, "traveling alone with a child, and people just don't care. It's so disappointing when you try to raise your kid with manners, but they see how selfish some adults are." Her son was now fully engaged with a tablet, volume cranked high enough to let me know he was watching some cartoon where everyone screamed every 3 seconds. He hadn't glanced at the window once. She glanced around for an ally, someone to join her outrage party. An older woman across the aisle offered a half-hearted smile, but quickly returned to her crossword. The man in front of us kept his nose buried in a business magazine, expertly avoiding eye contact. No one was biting. Frustrated, she escalated to phase 3. Authority involvement. Her finger shot up and jabbed the call button like she was reporting a crime. A flight attendant appeared moments later, all professional calm and polished patience. "Can I help you?" "I just wanted to bring something to your attention," the woman said, voice quivering with false bravado. "I'm a single mother traveling alone with my son, and this gentleman here refused to switch seats so my child could have the window. I thought maybe you could explain how kindness works." The flight attendant's eyes flicked to me, then to the boy, who was still glued to his screen. "Did you book this seat, sir?" the flight attendant asked me politely. "Yes," I said. "I paid extra for it." The flight attendant's smile was pure customer service steel. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said to the woman, "but we can't ask a passenger to give up a paid seat. If you wanted a window seat, they were available during booking." The woman's mouth opened and closed, stunned that the rules didn't bend for her personal preferences. "That's just ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "So we're punishing a child because someone is too selfish to swap for one flight?" The flight attendant's expression never wavered. "If you have any further concerns, we can discuss them after takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelt." The woman's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. She had expected support, applause even. Instead, she was firmly put in her place, at least for the moment. I settled back, confident I had won this battle. Little did I know, this was only the first skirmish. Turbulence in the aisle. The moment the flight attendant walked away, the air between me and the woman practically crackled with tension. She wasn't looking at me, not directly, but I could feel the weight of her side-eye burning into the side of my head, like a laser beam powered by pure, concentrated indignation. Her son, blissfully unaware of the war brewing around him, was still absorbed in his game. Some kind of brightly colored adventure involving cartoon animals and explosions loud enough to pierce even my noise-canceling headphones. For a kid whose supposed lifelong dream was gazing at clouds, he sure seemed satisfied with digital chaos. I thought, hoped, that maybe, just maybe, the firm response from the flight attendant would have been enough to ground the entire incident. Most people, when faced with an immovable boundary and the clear disinterest of everyone around them, would let the matter drop. Not her. This woman wasn't just a garden variety entitled passenger. She was a full-blown, self-proclaimed martyr for the cause of mothers everywhere, and she was not done. Her first tactic was the martyr mutter, a classic passive-aggressive performance art piece performed at medium volume, loud enough for anyone within a 3-row radius to hear. "Can you believe some people?" she murmured, her voice trembling with indignation. "I thought we lived in a society where people understood compassion, especially toward children. The lady across the aisle glanced at her, then immediately returned to her crossword puzzle. The businessman 2 rows ahead, who had been surreptitiously eavesdropping with the interest of a man who commutes weekly, sighed and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. No one wanted to get involved, and the woman was increasingly frustrated at the lack of outrage on her behalf. That's when she upped her game. She began sighing theatrically, every exhale a tragic declaration of her victimhood. Each breath was a stage performance, louder, heavier, more desperate than the last, until even her son paused his game long enough to glance at her with mild concern. "Mom?" he asked, pulling down his headphones. "Oh, honey," she said, placing a hand dramatically on her chest, as though she'd just received distressing news from a Victorian telegram. "It's just, some people aren't very nice. But it's okay, we'll be fine. We always are." The boy blinked, utterly unfazed, and popped his headphones back on before returning to his game. Whatever sympathy she'd hoped to stir from him was quickly swallowed by the lure of digital treasure hunts. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to shake my head and marvel at the sheer performative gall, but I knew better than to react. The one thing people like her crave more than a window seat is a reaction. They want the argument. They want the validation that their drama matters. I wasn't going to give her that. Then came stage 3, strategic alliances. She started making eye contact with nearby passengers, silently pleading for a co-conspirator. A man across the aisle, traveling with his teenage daughter, was her first target. "Don't you think," she said, loudly enough to cut through the hum of the engines, "that it's sad when children aren't shown kindness anymore?" The man, caught off guard with a pretzel halfway to his mouth, stammered something unintelligible before deciding to pretend he hadn't heard her. His daughter, who had the unmistakable expression of a teenager embarrassed by every adult on earth, turned toward the window and pretended to be asleep. Undeterred, the woman pivoted to her next potential ally, a younger woman in her early 20s sitting directly across the aisle. The young woman was wearing earbuds, but that didn't stop the entitled mother. "Excuse me," the woman said, leaning across her son and waving slightly to get the young woman's attention. The young woman pulled out an earbud. "Yes. Would you mind switching seats with me so my son can have a better view?" There was no polite preamble, no context, just a blunt demand disguised as a question. The young woman, taken aback, blinked several times before glancing down at her ticket. I'm sorry, I paid for this seat." The mother's eyes narrowed. "It's just, my son really wanted to sit by the window, and it would only be for this flight." The young woman, clearly uncomfortable, gave a nervous smile. "I am sorry. I'd really prefer to keep my seat." The mother sighed so loudly it might as well have been a scream. Wow. No one has any compassion anymore. At this point, the cabin was divided into 3 camps: the totally oblivious, the mildly irritated, and the handful of passengers who were now watching the unfolding drama like they were watching a reality show in real time. I fell firmly into the second group. I leaned back, adjusted my headphones, and tried to focus on my in-flight movie. But even the absurdity of an action hero dangling off a skyscraper couldn't distract me from the real-life antics unfolding just inches away. The flight attendant passed by again, and the woman seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice brimming with performative indignation. "I just want to formally register how unkind this entire situation is. It's incredibly unfair that a grown man can't show a little consideration for a child. I thought airlines were supposed to care about families." The flight attendant, whose patience was fraying like an overstretched rubber band, gave a tight-lipped smile. "As I mentioned earlier, seating assignments are based on reservations. If you'd like to request a seat change, you can speak with the gate agent upon landing." "But the flight is full," the woman snapped. "There won't be any open seats." "Then I'm afraid there's nothing I can do," the flight attendant said, still polite but now with the undertone of someone who's dealt with entitled passengers on every flight since the dawn of aviation. The woman huffed. "Fine. I just hope everyone here remembers how selfish some people can be." The flight attendant gave a brisk nod and moved on, leaving the woman to stew in her own resentment. But the thing about people like her, they don't stew silently. For the next hour, she narrated her suffering to her son, to herself, and to anyone in earshot. "I'm sorry, sweetie," she said to her son. "I know you were excited to see the clouds, but some people just don't care about making children happy." "Aha," the boy said, barely looking up from his game. "I guess we just have to learn that not everyone in the world has a heart," she added, making sure to glance my way as she said it. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't even make eye contact. I'd learned long ago that the best way to handle these kinds of people was to deny them the oxygen of attention. The boy, by now, was engrossed in a game about building a virtual amusement park. If he had any disappointment about missing the view, it was nowhere to be found. The woman, however, was unwilling to let go of her imagined crusade. For the next 2 hours, she cycled through every tactic in the entitled parent playbook. Dramatic sighs, muttered complaints, attempts to recruit allies, thinly veiled insults. She even, at one point, whispered loudly to her son, "I just hope when you grow up, you're not as selfish as some of the people on this plane." But despite her best efforts, no one took the bait. No fellow passengers rushed to her defense. No flight attendants demanded I move. No sympathetic stranger offered her a seat swap. She was, at last, forced to confront a reality she clearly found intolerable. The world was not bending to her will. And so, for the first time since boarding, she fell silent. Not the peaceful, accepting kind of silence. This was the sulky silence of someone planning their next move. And deep down, I knew she wasn't done yet. This battle was over. But the war, far from it. War at 35,000 feet. The silence from seat 12B was deceptive. The kind of silence you'd find in the seconds before a thunderstorm breaks the sky apart. Her lips were pressed so tight they looked like a pencil line. Her arms crossed so firmly they could have cut off circulation. To anyone glancing our way, she might have just looked like a tired mother with a grumpy child. Nothing unusual. But I knew better. I could feel the energy radiating off her like heat waves rising from pavement in August. This wasn't over. I leaned my head back, willing myself to focus on the hum of the engines, the occasional crackle from the PA system, the faint aroma of burnt coffee wafting down the aisle. Anything to drown out the magnetic pull of her hostility sitting just inches away. For a few minutes, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, she'd exhausted herself. She whispered to her son, who was still absorbed in his tablet, the glowing screen reflecting off his wide eyes. I could hear snippets. "You see, sweetie, this is why we always need to stand up for ourselves. People like him, they just think they're better than everyone else. Don't worry, Mommy will fix it." That last part made my stomach drop. Fix it? I knew enough about people like her to know that fixing it wasn't going to involve her suddenly realizing her behavior was out of line. No, in her mind, fixing it meant finding some way, any way, to turn the situation to her advantage. And I wasn't wrong. The fake friend gambit. Not even 10 minutes later, she whipped out her phone, cradling it in her lap at an angle that was half hidden but just visible enough for me to catch her screen. She wasn't texting anyone. No, she was pretending to be on a call, loudly enough for the whole row to hear. "Yeah, I'm on the plane now," she said, voice dripping with performative cheerfulness, the kind that only existed for show. "Oh, you wouldn't believe the selfishness I'm dealing with." I didn't look over, but I could feel her gaze bouncing off me like sonar. "No, seriously," she continued, fake laughter bubbling up. "Some grown man refused to let my sweet boy have the window. Can you imagine? A little kid, his first flight, and this guy just sat there like a lump." She paused, presumably letting her imaginary friend gasp in horror. I know. People are so heartless these days. It's no wonder the world's falling apart. And here I thought people would actually care about making memories for a child. It was one of the worst fake calls I'd ever witnessed. The pauses too long, the responses too rehearsed, the volume far too intentional. It was designed not for whoever was allegedly on the other end of the line, but for the passengers around us. She wanted someone, anyone, to turn around and validate her grievance. No one did. The teenage girl across the aisle glanced up briefly, but seeing my unwavering calm and the woman's exaggerated theatrics, she quickly buried her face back in her hoodie, pretending to sleep. The older woman with the crossword gave a small sniff of disapproval at the mother, not me, and turned the page. The businessman in front of me shifted in his seat again, visibly annoyed, but unwilling to become a character in this unfolding soap opera. I'd seen this tactic before. The public shaming attempt, only it doesn't work so well when your audience isn't buying tickets to the show. Weaponized kindness. When the fake call failed to generate any sympathy, she pivoted. Fast. The next move was so bold, so absurd, that I nearly snorted. She reached into her bag, rummaging around until she found a small plastic container filled with individually wrapped candies. With the exaggerated grace of someone bestowing a royal favor, she stood in the cramped space between our row and the next and started handing them out. "Would you like a candy?" she asked the teenager across the aisle, her voice honey-sweet. The girl took one, out of politeness if nothing else. "How about you?" she asked the older woman with the crossword. "I always bring extra for sharing." The older woman declined with a polite shake of her head. The businessman didn't even turn around. And then she turned to me. She beamed, holding out a piece of candy like a poisoned apple. "Candy?" she asked, her smile just a little too wide, a little too bright. I shook my head. "No, thank you." Her smile dimmed slightly, but she didn't let it drop. "You know," she said, loud enough for the whole row to hear, "sometimes all it takes is a little kindness to make someone's day better." I didn't respond. I didn't even shift in my seat. I wasn't playing her game. She stood there for a few seconds too long, hoping for a reaction. When none came, she returned to her seat with a theatrical sigh that practically rustled the safety card in the seatback pocket. Turbulence. External and internal. The plane hit a patch of mild turbulence not long after, and the pilot's calm voice came over the speakers to announce it was temporary. The plane shuddered gently, enough to make drink cups wobble, and the entitled mother gasped like she was on a roller coaster. She clutched her son's arm, who, predictably, didn't care, and used the turbulence as an excuse to grab my armrest. Not the middle one, my window side armrest, the one attached to my carefully paid-for seat. "Oh dear," she said, her fingers curling around the armrest like it was a life preserver. "These planes can be so bumpy." I pulled my arm away. Her grip lingered a second too long, her pinky finger actually brushing against my sleeve before she slowly, too slowly, withdrew her hand. "Sorry," she said, "not sorry at all. I'm just so nervous flying alone with my precious boy." The turbulence settled almost immediately, but she kept her hand close to the armrest, just in case. The lost innocence speech. With turbulence as her excuse gone, she pivoted again, leaning slightly toward her son. "You know, sweetie," she said, voice just loud enough to reach me, "when I was your age, people were so much kinder. Neighbors helped each other. Strangers gave up seats for mothers and children. But things have changed." Her son grunted something noncommittal, barely looking up. "It's just sad," she continued, her words a scalpel aimed at my ribs. "When you grow up, promise me you'll always be kind, even when others aren't." The boy didn't promise anything. He was building a digital roller coaster and didn't have the attention span for passive-aggressive life lessons. I stared straight ahead, my heartbeat steady, my hands resting on my lap. If her words were arrows, they bounced off my armor without leaving a mark. The final gambit, victimhood to the max. With all subtlety and manipulation exhausted, She slumped dramatically in her seat. Her shoulders sagged. Her breathing turned ragged, exaggerated just enough to be audible over the low cabin hum. She pulled out a tissue, already conveniently crumpled, and dabbed her eyes. Sniffled. Not a single tear actually fell. I just wanted to make his first flight special, she whispered, to no one and everyone. That's all. There it was, her final gambit, open, raw victimhood, for all the cabin to see. But the problem with that tactic is it only works if people believe you deserve sympathy. And after the fake calls, the candy bribery, the staged speeches, and the turbulence theatrics, no one bought it. The older woman sighed. The teenage girl rolled her eyes. Even the businessman, who hadn't said a word the whole flight, muttered under his breath, "Give it a rest." The woman's performance was over, and the audience had left the theater. I smiled, not at her, but at the window. My window, my seat, my peace reclaimed. And we still had 3 hours to go. Desperation at cruising altitude. For a moment, the cabin settled into that post-drama lull. The kind where everyone involved pretends the confrontation never happened, while still replaying every word in their heads. The entitled mother sat in her seat, stiff as a plank, her exaggerated sighs less frequent but no less deliberate. Each one was a performance, a carefully placed woe is me soundbite, just loud enough to register without anyone being able to accuse her of causing a scene. It would have been almost peaceful, if not for the palpable tension still hanging in the air, like the scent of oversweet airline coffee. Her son, ever oblivious, was now building some kind of pixelated fortress on his tablet. Whatever dreams of gazing at clouds she had projected onto him had evaporated completely. But for her, the window seat wasn't the point anymore. It never had been. This wasn't about her son's first flight, or some fleeting childhood memory she was desperate to create. It was about control. The battle for Seat 12A had become a full-scale psychological war, and the only unacceptable outcome, at least in her mind, was losing. The long game begins when her direct approaches, guilt, public performance, and emotional manipulation, all failed. I expected her to sulk in silence for the rest of the flight. But I underestimated her. Some people, when faced with an unyielding wall, accept their fate. Others, they start digging tunnels. I caught the first sign of it out of the corner of my eye. She leaned across her son, her phone in hand, angling the screen just enough for me to see. It was deliberate, like leaving a diary open to a particularly damning page and hoping someone accidentally reads it. She was composing a post, probably for whatever mom-themed social media group would offer the most validation. People are so selfish these days. My sweet little boy's first flight, and this grown man refused to give up his window seat so my baby could see the clouds. Where's the compassion? Where's the kindness? If this is the world we're raising our children in, I'm heartbroken. A picture of her son, clutching his stuffed animal, was preloaded beneath the caption. Except the picture was months old. The kid's hair was shorter, his face rounder. I could tell she had prepared for this kind of post in advance, stockpiling ammunition for whatever entitlement battle she might need to wage. She didn't post it. Not yet. She wanted me to see it first. I didn't react. She shifted, angling the screen closer. Nothing from me. Finally, she huffed, loud and exaggerated, and hit post, with the flourish of someone dropping the mic at a talent show. The ripple effect. What she hadn't considered, though, was how thoroughly over it the rest of the passengers were. The teenage girl across the aisle, who had been pretending to sleep, lifted her head and glanced at the screen. Her expression shifted from exhausted patience to something closer to amused disbelief. "Seriously," the girl muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. I risked a glance her way, catching her eye for the briefest second. There was no need for words. In that one shared look, a quiet alliance formed, not one of action, but of mutual understanding. The older woman with the crossword wasn't far behind. When the mother let out yet another sigh, The woman exhaled sharply through her nose, the universal sound of someone reaching the end of their rope. "Some people," the older woman muttered, not even bothering to hide her annoyance. The businessman, who had stayed stoically uninvolved until now, finally lowered his magazine. "Lady," he said, his voice low but firm, "let it go." It was such a small thing, 4 words, calmly spoken, but they hit the mother like a slap across the face. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening and closing in a perfect imitation of a fish gasping for air. "What did you say?" she hissed, her voice cracking around the edges. "I said," the man repeated, barely looking at her, "let it go. You've been at this for 2 hours. It's embarrassing." The color drained from her face, replaced with blotchy red patches crawling up her neck. This was not part of her script. She had expected allies, sympathy, or, at worst, indifference. Open pushback. That was new. Tactical retreat. Almost. For a blissful minute, she actually shut up. Her son, sensing a change in the atmosphere, took off his headphones and glanced between his mother and the businessman, his brow furrowed in confusion. But silence is not the same as surrender. The gears were turning behind her eyes. I could almost hear her recalculating her strategy, assessing every angle, searching for a new point of leverage. And then, she found it. The fake medical crisis. It started with a hand to her chest. Not sudden, not dramatic, just enough to be noticed. She rubbed her sternum, her breathing slightly exaggerated. A few passengers, the kind who had been studiously ignoring her until now, glanced her way. Her breathing became louder, shallower. The teenage girl's eyes narrowed in suspicion. The businessman muttered something under his breath, returning to his magazine. The mother exhaled sharply and leaned forward, bracing herself on the seat back ahead. I don't feel well," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't buy it for a second. But the flight attendant, obligated by both professionalism and basic safety protocols, was at her side within moments. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" The mother clutched her chest again. "It's just stress," she whispered. "Traveling alone. My heart feels funny." The flight attendant's face softened, but her voice remained calm and professional. "Would you like some water? We can check your vitals if you're feeling unwell." The mother shook her head, milking the moment for all it was worth. No, it's just, I didn't expect people to be so unkind." There it was, her real agenda, laid bare like a poker player turning over a losing hand and hoping for sympathy. The flight attendant, to her credit, didn't bite. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, before retreating. But the moment had worked, at least partially. A few passengers, unfamiliar with the full saga, glanced my way with mild curiosity. Had I caused this poor woman's heart palpitations? The teenage girl, though, wasn't having it. "She's faking," the girl muttered. Not loud enough to cause a scene, but loud enough for me to hear. I gave her a small, appreciative nod. The desperation spiral. With no major confrontation to feed on, the mother was left with nothing but her own growing frustration. She alternated between glaring at me and glancing around for someone, anyone, who might still see her as a wronged heroine. But the tide had turned. The older woman openly ignored her, her crossword folded neatly on her lap. The businessman had put in earbuds. Even her son was losing patience, tugging on her sleeve. "Mom, I'm hungry," he said, entirely unimpressed with her theatrics. That was the final blow. She fished a crumpled granola bar from her purse and handed it to him wordlessly. Her energy had deflated, her arsenal exhausted. I leaned against the window, my window, and let myself relax for the first time since takeoff. She had lost. The final whisper. As the flight descended, the mother made one last feeble attempt. She leaned closer, just enough to make sure I could hear her. "You should be ashamed," she whispered. "I hope no one ever treats your kids this way." I didn't look at her, but the teenage girl across the aisle did. "Lady," The girl said, her voice clear and confident. "He doesn't owe you anything. Get over yourself." The mother's mouth dropped open, but the girl was already turning away, popping her earbuds back in. The plane landed. I stepped off first, savoring the sweet, oxygen-rich air of victory. The mother, her son in tow, hurried past me, too humiliated to meet my eye. And just like that, the skies were clear again. Grounded grievances. The plane's wheels kissed the tarmac with a gentle bump, followed by the familiar whir of reverse thrusters and the synchronized clatter of overhead bins being unlashed prematurely. Passengers stirred, stretched, and braced themselves for the inevitable shuffle into the narrow aisle, the unofficial Olympic sport of airline travel, deplaning chaos. For the first time since boarding, I exhaled fully, my shoulders loosening as the tension of the last few hours slowly unraveled. The mother in 12B had been blessedly silent for the final stretch of the flight, her defeat too obvious to even pretend otherwise. But that silence wasn't victory, it was incubation. I've met people like her before, the kind who could never just let something go. To her, this wasn't just about a window seat. It was about pride, about never admitting she might be wrong, and about ensuring the world saw her as the innocent victim, even if she had to rewrite the story herself. And if the audience on the plane hadn't played along, maybe she'd find a new one on the ground. The seatbelt light clicked off, triggering the human instinct to leap into the aisle. I stayed put, content to let the impatient herd go first. I knew she'd try something, and I wasn't about to give her the advantage of proximity. But the woman wasn't in a rush. She sat rigid, gripping the top of her son's backpack, her face a calculated blend of weariness and injustice. Her son, oblivious as ever, was more concerned with how much battery his tablet had left than his mother's honor war. For him, this flight had been boring. No grand window views, no magical cloud castles, just his favorite game and a half-stale granola bar. When the line inched forward, I stood, stretching deliberately, and pulled my bag from the overhead bin. I could feel her eyes drilling into the back of my head, but I didn't turn. There was no point. Engaging her now would just reignite her desperate performance. The slow march off the plane began, and I made my way down the jet bridge. The stale airport air hit my face, somehow cooler, cleaner than the recycled cabin oxygen, and I felt the first real sense of relief. Freedom was so close. The airport ambush. But I should have known better. Entitled people don't quit. They regroup. I had barely made it past the gate area when I heard her voice, pitched higher than usual, radiating that particular blend of performative distress and calculated volume. "There he is. That's the man I was telling you about." I froze, turning slowly to see her standing just a few feet away, her son trailing behind her, bored and scuffing his sneakers on the carpet. She wasn't talking to security, thankfully, but to a gate agent, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had the face of someone who dealt with every flavor of traveler meltdown imaginable. The agent's expression already screamed, "Ma'am, I do not get paid enough for this." The mother's eyes locked onto mine, triumphant. "I need to file a formal complaint," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "This man ruined my son's first flight." The gate agent's expression didn't shift, though I saw the faintest flicker of skepticism in her eyes. "Ruined," she repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," the mother said, her volume rising. "I asked him, politely, if my son could have the window seat, and he refused. A grown man refused to show an ounce of kindness to a child on his very first plane ride." Her son, overhearing, tugged her sleeve. "Mom, it's okay." I didn't. She shushed him so fast you'd think he'd just cursed in church. "Hush, sweetheart. Mommy's handling this." The gate agent glanced at me, silently asking for my side of the story with a tired tilt of her head. I kept my voice calm, even professional. "I paid extra for the window seat when I booked my ticket." I politely declined her request to switch. The gate agent's brow lifted a fraction. You paid for the seat. Correct. That was all she needed to hear. Ma'am, she said, turning back to the woman, seats are assigned based on the passenger's reservation. If this gentleman paid for the window, he's entitled to it. The mother's face flushed red. But what about compassion? What about basic decency? What about the children? The gate agent gave a smile so thin it was practically a wire. We encourage passengers to book seats that meet their needs. If you require a window seat for your son on future flights, I recommend selecting that option during booking. The woman sputtered. You're rewarding selfishness. The agent's smile didn't waver. Is there anything else I can assist you with today, ma'am? The woman opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fury bubbling just beneath the surface. She knew she'd lost, at least officially. But the game wasn't over. The court of public opinion. We moved out of the gate area, but she wasn't done with me. No, she trailed behind me through the terminal, her voice rising in volume as she narrated her plight to no one in particular, but loud enough for passing travelers to hear. Can't believe the airline supports this kind of selfishness. Just trying to make memories with my son. What kind of grown man refuses a child? Her son, now visibly embarrassed, walked a few paces ahead of her, his shoulders hunched, his tablet forgotten in his hand. People glanced at me, then at her, some with curiosity, some with annoyance, most just trying to get to their connecting flights without getting dragged into whatever melodrama she was staging. I could have walked faster, left her behind, but some perverse part of me was curious to see just how far she'd take this. The fake security threat. As we approached baggage claim, her voice hit a new pitch. I wonder if airport security even knows how rude some of their passengers are. That was enough. I turned, finally meeting her gaze. Ma'am, I said quietly, if you're implying you're going to involve airport security over a seat assignment, I suggest you reconsider. Her eyes sparkled, the thrill of confrontation. I'm just saying, she said sweetly, it would be a shame if people thought you were a threat to children. The insinuation hung there, ugly and obvious. I took a slow breath. You're welcome to tell security anything you like, but keep in mind, there are witnesses on that plane, and they saw everything. Her smile faltered, just a little. Would you like me to ask the flight attendants to back up my story? I added, or maybe some of the other passengers. That broke her composure. The mask slipped, just for a second, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty beneath the outrage. I'm just trying to teach my son about kindness, she muttered, retreating into martyrdom one last time. Then maybe you should show him some, I said, and walked away. The departure. I retrieved my bag and headed for the exit, leaving her standing there, red-faced, defeated, and ignored by the bustling crowd of disinterested travelers. She didn't follow me. As I stepped into the cool, humid air outside the terminal, I finally felt it. That sweet, unburdened relief of knowing the flight was behind me. Whatever twisted logic had driven that woman, whatever sense of entitlement had powered her for hours, it no longer mattered. I had my window seat. She had her lesson. Whether or not she'd actually learned it was her problem, not mine. And somewhere, her son might one day grow up and remember that first flight, not for the clouds he didn't see, but for the way his mother turned a seat into a spectacle. The sky, I realized, had never looked clearer. When entitlement lands, the automatic doors slid open, and the humid Florida air settled around me like a warm blanket. The scent of hot pavement, exhaust fumes, and airport food blended into an oddly comforting cocktail. The smell of freedom after hours of high-altitude hostage negotiations with a professional victim. I paused just outside the terminal, rolling my shoulder to shake off the last traces of tension. But peace, it seemed, was still a few steps ahead of me, because the unmistakable click-clack of hurried footsteps echoed from behind. She wasn't done. I didn't turn around immediately. There was a primal instinct in me, the same one that tells you not to look a wild animal directly in the eye. But I could feel her approach, her presence a storm cloud hovering just out of sight. Excuse me. Her voice rang out, thin and brittle, as though she was balancing her outrage on a wire. I'm not done talking to you. I closed my eyes for a half-second, breathed in the humid air and turned. There she was, her son trailing several feet behind, shoulders slumped under the weight of a mother who had no off switch. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice even. "We're off the plane. We're not seatmates anymore. Let it go." But people like her never let it go. Her face was a mosaic of emotions: anger, desperation, self-righteousness, and something else. Fear. No, not fear of me. Fear of irrelevance. Fear that after hours of performing, no one cared anymore. "You humiliated me in front of my son," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What kind of person treats a mother like that?" I glanced at her son, who was making patterns in the airport tile with the toe of his sneaker, clearly desperate to be anywhere else. "What kind of mother turns a seat assignment into a public circus?" I replied calmly. Her face turned red, blotchy with the kind of anger that has nowhere to go. "I was just trying to make his first flight special." "No," I said, cutting through her excuse. "You were trying to win. That's all this was. A power play. It had nothing to do with him." She recoiled as though I'd slapped her, her mouth opening and closing in wordless sputters. "That's not true," she finally managed, but there was no conviction in it. Even she didn't believe herself. The audience returns. The universe, with its impeccable comedic timing, had arranged for a small audience to gather nearby. A cluster of passengers from our flight were waiting for their rides or lingering by the baggage carousel. The teen girl from the aisle, her hoodie now tied around her waist, stood with her father, both watching with the mild curiosity of people who'd already seen Act 1 through 5 and were curious how the final scene would play out. The older woman with the crossword leaned against a pillar, her arms crossed, a tiny smile tugging at her mouth. Even the businessman, who had bolted off the plane like his life depended on it, had paused to check his phone nearby, clearly overhearing everything. The mother wasn't just losing this argument. She was losing her audience's sympathy, and I could tell she knew it. Switching tactics. Again. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage her narrative, she turned to the crowd instead of me, her hands flying into the air like a preacher mid-sermon. "Can you believe this? All I wanted was one little moment for my son. One. And this man acted like I was trying to steal his whole vacation." The girl in the hoodie spoke up before I could. "Lady, we were all there. Your kid didn't even care about the window." The mother's head snapped around. "Excuse me." "You heard me," the girl said, unbothered. "He was playing Minecraft the whole time. You were the only one freaking out." A ripple of chuckles passed through the group. The mother's face went crimson again, but she wasn't going to retreat, not with her pride on the line. "You're just a child," she snapped. "You don't understand what it's like to be a parent." The girl shrugged. "I understand what it's like to sit next to one who's embarrassing herself." Her father, standing beside her, didn't intervene, didn't even scold her for the sass. If anything, he looked a little proud. The emotional gambit. When shaming me, the flight attendants, and even the passengers didn't work, the mother pivoted into her oldest and most familiar role, the victim. She pressed her hand to her chest, staggered slightly, just enough to make it look unintentional. "I'm just so tired," she said, her voice trembling. "Being a single mother is so hard, and all I wanted was one simple kindness." The older woman with the crossword spoke up at last. "Honey, being a mother doesn't mean everyone owes you anything. You want a window seat? You book a window seat. That's how the world works." The mother's mouth fell open again, stunned at being scolded by someone her own age. She wasn't used to peer pushback, only the imagined moral high ground that came from berating younger people. "You're all heartless," she whispered, spinning her narrative into one last tragic bow. "This world has no compassion left." "No," I said softly. "This world just doesn't hand you what you want because you throw a tantrum." The son speaks. Her son, who had been silent for nearly the entire flight and the drama that followed, finally broke his silence. "Mom," he said quietly, tugging her sleeve. "Can we go? I'm hungry." It was such a simple, childlike request, so ordinary that it cut through the absurdity like a knife through butter. For a moment, her mask slipped entirely. She was no longer the crusader for maternal justice, no longer the tragic heroine of her own soap opera. She was just a tired woman, standing in an airport with a son who wanted chicken nuggets more than he wanted a moral victory. But she couldn't let it go. Not fully. "Fine," she snapped, yanking his hand a little too hard. "But don't expect people to be kind to you, sweetheart. The world is full of selfish people." He frowned, his brow furrowing, but said nothing. Together, they walked toward the exit, her shoulders tense, his steps slow and reluctant. As they disappeared into the crowd, the tension around us evaporated, leaving only the faint aftertaste of her drama hanging in the air. Post-drama reflection. The teen girl's father turned to me, nodding in approval. "Handled that well," he said. "Some people just live for the fight." "I've noticed," I said dryly. The girl gave me a thumbs up before heading off with her dad. The older woman with the crossword offered a small smile before following suit. I stood there a moment longer, watching the mother and son disappear into the sea of travelers, wondering, not for the first time, how much of this her son would remember. Would this flight become part of his childhood lore, a funny story he told his friends years later? Or would it fade into the background noise of all the other times his mother's entitlement turned something simple into something exhausting? Either way, the sky was clear now. My seat, my view, my peace, all intact. I took a deep breath, hailed a cab, and left the storm behind. The moral: entitlement rarely gets you what you want, but it always gets you remembered, just not the way you hoped.